extremely critical of the Black Bloc anarchists. It appears to me that the resources of the state, or tremendous resources of the state, have been employed against the Occupy movement. We've seen that externally with the physical eradication of occupying encampments. It's been more difficult to see internally how they are working to subvert the movement. But I think it's very clear what the goal is. The goal is to sever the Occupy movement from the mainstream, because the Occupy movement is fundamentally a mainstream movement. It articulates the aspirations and the grievances of the majority of Americans. It carries on a dialogue, whether that is about healthcare, jobs, the looting of the US Treasury by Wall Street, the destruction of basic civil liberties, including habeas corpus, and at the end of the table, Carl Mayer will talk about the lawsuit that we have brought, and we were in federal court all day last Thursday against Barack Obama and Leon Panetta for the National Defense Authorization Act. The movement is young. I covered movements in Eastern Europe. I covered all the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. I covered all the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. I covered the 2 Palestinian uprisings, or intifadas. And no movement has a kind of straight trajectory. It has reverses. It makes mistakes. And if it finds within it the capacity to be self-critical and self-reflective, it moves forward from the stumbles and errors that are inevitable in any movement, and any of you who's looked closely at the civil rights movement knows that that is precisely what happened. There is no way that we can compete with the resources of the security and surveillance state. We can't beat them at their own game. It's utterly impossible. I watched the fall of the Stasi state in East Germany. I was there day after day in Leipzig and later in East Berlin. This was the most pervasive security state probably in the history of humankind. For every 63 East Germans, there was a Stasi informant, and yet the state fell. And it fell because of what Václav Havel in his 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, understood was the strength of all popular movements which articulate a fundamental truth, and it's counterintuitive, but it is that nature of powerlessness itself. That is our greatest strength. Transparency, honesty, and a rigid adherence to nonviolence, and respect, even for those pillars of authority that do not respect us. There's a reason that Martin Luther King kept going to Birmingham, to Bull Connor, who was a thug, because he understood that Bull Connor would overreact and expose the callous, dark heart of white supremacy and white power. And that is our strength, and that is what they are seeking to eradicate. And the portal into the movement by which they will break it is essentially Black Bloc anarchism, because it permits or calls on followers to cover their faces, that is a gift to the security state, and to carry out acts of petty vandalism and embrace a kind of repugnant cynicism that these people confuse with revolution. And it is incumbent upon all of us as we build this movement, and I reach back to my seminary training, to grasp that there are rights and wrongs. Tolerance, which is a word Martin Luther King never used, is, as Karl Popper points out in The Open Society, at its enemies. when you are battling forces of intolerance, deadly. Because as Papa writes, what vanishes is not only tolerance, but the tolerant along with them. We have to have agreements about how we comport ourselves in the face of corporate power. We have to make sure that we do not attempt to engage in the kind of paranoia, secrecy, violence, including linguistic violence, that are the hallmarks and characteristics of the corporate state. All of these regimes, and this was true in Eastern Europe, collapse because they are so internally decayed. And what we are doing is, by getting out and expressing this truth, unmasking the charade, exposing who it is that is behind these great monolithic walls. And this message finally resonates most effectively with those who are actually inside the power structure itself. When street demonstrations in Leipzig began to reach numbers of 60 and 70,000, Erich Honecker, the dictator of East Germany, sent down an elite paratroop division that he ordered to fire on the crowd. And when they got there, neither the commanders or the local Communist Party officials would permit that paratroop division to shoot. At that point, East Germany as an entity was over. Honecker lasted in power another week. This was also true in Czechoslovakia, and it was true in Romania, where Ceausescu attempted to call on the security forces. That holding fast to that truth, grasping that the power we have is our powerlessness, our transparency, and our honesty, if we can find the self-discipline, the moral courage, and the strength to hold fast to these values, and that will require confronting and expelling those within the movement who refuse to accept those values, then I think we can bring them down.
I just want to have a question for Chris Hedges. You recently wrote a question about, an article about the cancer and the Occupy movement, really focused on anarchy and Black Bloc anarchists. Being an anarchist myself, I'm very curious on how much you actually know about the Occupy movement, seeing how a good portion of our processes were written by anarchists. How would you respond to that?
My attack wasn't against anarchism. I come out of Christian anarchism. Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker movement, that was my whole formation. I'm not opposed to anarchism. I buy the Julian Benda vision of the world, which is that you are in perpetual alienation, even antagonism to centers of power, no matter what those centers of power are. I would say that that is a pretty good summation of precisely what the teachings of Jesus Christ were in the Gospels within the seminary. So this was hardly an attack on anarchism. It was an attack on stupidity. When you carry out acts of feral or spontaneous vandalism, what you're doing is essentially taking the easy way out. It doesn't take any planning, it doesn't take any thought, it's not strategic, and frankly, it plays exactly into the hands of the corporate forces that are trying to destroy this movement. And I have no doubt that the number of agents provocateurs within the movement have coalesced around the Black Bloc. In terms of jail time, I've been in jail. How long is enough? As Wendell Berry says, going to jail is more time than I care to donate to the federal government, but I donate it, and I suppose you can argue not insufficient time, but it's not within my. When I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs, I do not tell the NYPD when I'm going to be released. That's not a discussion. They come and tell me. And I think that civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, is the route. I have great admiration for groups like Veterans for Peace and Code Pink, who I have joined, who I admire. I think that, you know, a lot of the people in groups like Veterans for Peace or Code Pink, they've been doing this a really long time, and we'd be very smart to listen to the lessons they've learned.
Yeah, my question's for Chris Hedges. You said that there's no place for black blocking in any kind of social, economic, or cultural revolution or shift in the way people think. And my question is how can you say that? I mean, every social change, including the movement in India with Gandhi, there were riots there. There was financial problems with the British government. There's multitudes of reasons. Things can't be done entirely peacefully. With the civil rights movement here, there were riots. People were hurt, people were killed for this. So my question is how can you say that there is not a time and place for black blocking or violence? And how can you think that black blocking is hindering the Occupy movement? I've been in McPherson Square for over 5 months now, and I can't think of a single time that an anarchist presence or a black bloc presence has held back or hindered the Occupy movement.
Let me answer the question about the black bloc.
Please do.
Violence is something that I know intimately. I've spent 20 years as a war correspondent. I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war when we were surrounded by the Serbs. 2,000 artillery shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day, 45 of my own colleagues, foreign correspondents, killed, my photographer wounded 3 days after I arrived. I know what violence is. It's not theoretical for me. And sitting in a basement in Sarajevo having a discussion about pacifism would have evoked gales of laughter. But I also understand the poison of violence. Violence is always tragic. Human beings can be pushed to that extent, but they are not free then from the corruption of violence. So that the defenses in Sarajevo were organized by gangsters, the criminal class, cello, the people who had an access to weapons and a penchant for violence. And when they weren't shooting at the Serbs, they were raiding the apartments of ethnic Serbs, looting them, and often killing them. That's what violence unleashes. I'm not saying that a human population, because I've seen it in El Salvador, where the death squads were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month, I'm not saying that there doesn't come a moment in which you must employ violence to ensure your own survival, to ward off forces that seek your own annihilation. We all knew in Sarajevo what would happen if they broke through that trench system. A third of the city would have been slaughtered and the rest would have been driven into refugee and displacement camps, which is what happened in the Drina Valley and happened in Vukovar. So violence is something that I know. And I don't rule out the fact that the blindness and obtuseness of the security state, the failure to heed the legitimate calls for justice, could push us towards acts of violence. But at that point, for me, there's nothing glorious or good about it. It's always tragic. The best weapon we have right now is building numbers, as I saw in East Germany, as I saw in Czechoslovakia, as I saw in Romania, as we saw in Tahrir Square, to bring down the corporate state. And what I find distasteful among the Black Bloc is a romanticization of violence, which frankly, they know nothing about.
You know so much about violence, which you obviously do. How can you equate it with spray painting a building or breaking breaking a piece of glass.
There's definitely an important debate to have about violence versus nonviolence. In the category of violence, I would include property destruction. Some people don't, but that's a debatable point. The real issue is, how do we grow the movement? How do we draw more people to the movement? And when you break a store window, you actually justify police violence. We don't want to justify police violence. I think it's very obvious right from the beginning of Occupy Wall Street and how this movement grew, why nonviolence is the strategy we need to adopt strongly, and including that, non-property destruction. Remember the moment, the beginning of Occupy Wall Street, the first week, there was a protest at Union Square. Some women had been arrested. They were behind an orange mesh holder, and an officer Bologna came with blue pepper spray in their face for no reason. Immediately you heard one of the blue-collar officers saying, "Wow, I can't believe you just pepper sprayed her." Now, if those women had been throwing batteries, had been cursing, had been throwing apples, had been calling them pigs, had been saying war on pigs, you know what? That blue-collar officer wouldn't have said, "Wow, I can't believe you just pepper sprayed her." And the audience that was watching that on TV that night wouldn't be saying, "Wow, I can't believe you just pepper sprayed her." They would be saying that police violence was justified. We need to not justify police violence. When we do that, I want to applaud those women who did not act violently in response to the police, but instead stood non-violently. And same with those UC Davis kids at college at UC Davis who didn't react with violence to police violence, because that is how we grow the movement. The strategy of nonviolent change is not. Oh, and we have also in front of here our 84-year-old pepper sprayer. There is actually empirical evidence on how nonviolent movements shift power. And the evidence, first off, there's a book that you can read about this. It's an empirical study of how civil resistance works. And it compares first nonviolent resistance with violent. And by the way, nonviolent wins much more than violent. Violent rarely wins, because who wants to be involved in a guerrilla war? That's not really attractive. And second, they compare nonviolent movements that succeed and nonviolent movements that fail. And what the key distinction is, the ones that fail are fringe movements, the ones that succeed are mass movements. Our job is to be a mass movement. Breaking store windows, cursing the police, that does not create a mass movement. It has happened in the Occupy movement. That divides us. That divides us rather than unites us, and unites the opposition against us. So that's why it's important for us to be very strongly nonviolent, including opposed to property destruction.
That's violence. I'd like to hear from her.
I would like to say to the anarchists, they really are not anarchists, they're hoodlums.
There's a difference.
And I go around and help to teach nonviolence. And when I got pepper sprayed, it would have been very easy to say to this cop, "You pigs." And I didn't. But afterwards, I raised my hands to those two kids that held me up so I wouldn't be run over. And I said, "We just did it, we got on the map." And that's the way we need to act. Thank you.